Alright, we're on video 4 now. Scroll down to the bottom here, change pages. Life comes from life. Another big heading, so make sure you record that on the right hand side as such. Today, when people observe young plants in a garden or see a litter of puppies, they know that these new organisms are the result of reproduction. 400 years ago, however, people believed that life could appear suddenly from non-living material. For example, when people saw flies swarming around decaying meat, they concluded that flies could arise from rotting meat. When frogs appeared in muddy puddles after heavy rains, people concluded that frogs could sprout from the mud in ponds. The mistaken idea that living things arise from non-living sources is called spontaneous generation. It took hundreds of years of experiments to convince people that spontaneous generation does not occur. One scientist who did some of these experiments was an Italian doctor, Francesco Redi. In the mid-1600s, Redi designed a controlled experiment that showed flies do not spontaneously arise from decaying meat. In a controlled experiment, a scientist carries out two tests that are identical in every respect except for one factor. I want to point out something here. So in the controlled experiment, you don't just have all kinds of things going on. You change one part of the experiment to see what the results are. The one factor that the scientist changes is called a manipulated variable. We also call it in science class the independent variable. So manipulated variable and independent variable are the same thing. The scientists can conclude that any difference in the results of the two tests must be due to the variable. So see what happens if you change more than one thing, you don't know what caused your results. Scroll down a little here. After Redi's work, many people continued to believe that spontaneous generation occurred in bacteria. In the mid-1800s, a French chemist, Louis Pasteur, designed some controlled experiments that finally disproved spontaneous generation. Disprove, of course, means it proved that it was wrong. The controlled experiments of Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur helped to convince people that living things do not arise from non-living material. Look at the experiments of Redi and Pasteur and learn more about the experiments they performed. So I'm going to click this button here to show detail. I'm going to make it larger so we can see everything. Alright, so Redi designed one of the first controlled experiments. By Pasteur's time, controlled experiments were standard procedure. As you explore, identify the manipulated variable in each experiment. So here's Redi's experiment. As you can see, Redi placed meat in two identical jars. He left one jar uncovered. He covered the other jar with cloth and let in air. After 2 days, Redi saw maggots, young flies, on the decaying meat in the open jar. There were no maggots on the meat in the covered jar. Redi reasoned that flies had laid the eggs on the meat in the open jar. The eggs hatched into maggots. Because flies could not lay eggs on the meat in the covered jar, there were no maggots there. Therefore, Redi concluded that the decaying meat did not produce the maggots. And he did that correctly. In Pasteur's experiment, in one experiment, Pasteur put clear broth. Broth is like chicken bouillon or beef bouillon. It's like soup without the stuff in it, just the liquid, into two flasks with curved necks. The necks would let in oxygen but keep out bacteria from the air. Pasteur boiled the broth in one flask to kill any bacteria in the broth. He did not boil the broth in the other flask. In a few days, the unboiled broth became cloudy, showing that new bacteria were growing. The boiled broth remained clear. Pasteur concluded that bacteria do not spontaneously arise from the broth. New bacteria appeared only when living bacteria were already present. By the way, bacteria are in so many different things, or they're ubiquitous, we say, they're everywhere, that it's hard to keep them out of the broth. Later, Pasteur took the curved neck flask containing the broth that had remained clear and broke its long neck. In a few days, the broth became cloudy. This evidence confirmed Pasteur's conclusion that new bacteria appear only when they are produced by existing bacteria.